Yes, sir. It is on.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the PhD thesis colloquium of P.N. Karthik. His PhD thesis is titled Sequential Control Sensing to Detect an Anomalous Process. Over to Karthik.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for making your presence felt virtually here. So let me share my screen. Okay, so the title of the talk is Sequential Control Sensing to Detect an Anomalous Process. It's been a wonderful journey looking at this problem, studying this problem from different angles. There are many aspects to this, many faces to this. So hopefully I'll be able to uncover all of these to you in this talk. So I would like to start by telling you the motivation for what the talk is about, how we started on this problem. Now, in order to proceed, I would like one of the participants, one of the attendees, to please come up and volunteer for a visual search experiment that will involve finding an odd image in a sea of distractor images. So can I request any one of the participants to please come up and volunteer for this experiment, for this exercise?
I can do it.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Hi, Krishna. Thanks. So, yeah, so on the next slide, I'm going to show a set of 20 images, out of which one of the images is going to be different. And the goal will be to identify this odd image, this odd man out image, as quickly and accurately as possible. Okay. So whenever you have the answer with you, you can just speak ready on the mic and I will stop. I will start a timer here. Once you say ready, I'm going to stop the timer and you will tell me the answer. Okay, so I hope that's okay.
Okay.
So I'll start the timer now. Let me, okay. So 3, 2, 1, and go.
Ready?
Okay, so where's the odd image?
Second row, fourth one.
Correct. So that's the odd image, second row, fourth column. So that took you about 5.5 seconds. So let's repeat this experiment on a different set of images. 3, 2, 1, start.
Ready.
Okay, so where's the odd image?
Second row, second one.
Correct, second row, second one. And this took you about 4.9 seconds on my timer. Last set of images, 3, 2, 1, and go.
Ready.
Okay, so where's the odd image?
3,4. Third row, fourth image.
Correct. So this took you about 3.5 seconds. Okay, so this is typically the case. The first one is usually perceived to be very hard. Thank you, Krishna. I'll call you onto the stage once more at a slightly later time, perhaps after 2 or 3 slides.
Sure.
So this is typically the case. So human subjects find it difficult to identify the odd image in the first case. They take more time in that, slightly lesser time in the second one, and less time, the least of all the 3 times in the third one. So the time to find the odd image clearly depends on what images are shown on the screen. And the closer the image pairs are to the eyes, as perceived by the eyes, the longer it would take to find the odd image. Okay, so I think that is one hypothesis that we can make. Of course, I think it also depends on whether it is a priori told what the 2 images are. So if one is a priori told that one is supposed to look for a black rectangle on top of a white rectangle as the odd image, then perhaps the eyes will actually start looking for that. Okay, so it will also depend on that. So there are 2 quantities that are of interest to us in these experiments. What are those? They are the time to find the odd image. That is one. We would like to do it as quickly as possible. Also, at the same time, the error in reporting the final odd image is very important. So perhaps in the experiments that we saw, the volunteer Krishna actually took a lot of time to make sure he doesn't make a mistake. Okay, but if one were to allow some error in terms of the final reporting, in terms of reporting the final answer, perhaps one could do a little faster. Okay, so not only is the time to find the odd image important, the error in reporting the final answer is also equally important. Okay, and ideally we would like to keep both of them small. But in order to carry out analysis, it turns out that it is customary to fix one quantity and analyze the other quantity in terms of the quantity that is fixed. So throughout this talk, what we are going to do is we are going to fix the error in reporting the final answer, and we are going to look at the time required to find the odd image as a function of this error. Okay, so this is what is called as the fixed confidence regime in the literature. Okay, so suppose pi is some strategy to find the odd image in these experiments. For example, the volunteer Krishna he had his own strategy to find the odd image. He looked at some images, he looked here and there, possibly after some time, he zeroed in on the odd image. So he had his own strategy. Let tau pi denote the time that is required to find the odd image under this strategy pi. And given an error tolerance epsilon, let pi epsilon denote the collection of all epsilon error tolerable policies. Okay, so these are all policies which have to make sure that the final error in reporting the answer is within the threshold epsilon. What Vaidyan et al. Did is that they showed that for any two image pairs I1 and I2, if it is of interest that the policies have to wait until they are sufficiently confident of what the odd image location is, it turns out that the expected time required to find the odd image grows like logarithm of 1 over epsilon. Vaidyan et al. Were able to characterize this mathematically. In fact, they were able to precisely nail down what this constant alpha of I1 comma I2 that is shown on this slide is. Okay, their result was that in the asymptotic limit, as the error probability vanishes, alpha of I1, I2 captures the correct growth rate of the expected time required to find the odd image. Okay, so alpha of I1, I2 is going to depend upon many things. Number one, it is of course going to depend on what the image pairs I1 and I2 are. Number two, it is also going to depend on whether the image pairs I1 and I2 are known beforehand or are not known beforehand. And of course, I1, I2, if they are switched, this value is going to be different. If I1 is the odd image, I2 is the distractor, the value of alpha I1, I2 is going to be different from when I2 is the odd image and I1 is the distractor image. Okay, so they were able to nail this down precisely. Now, all of these are for static images. Okay, now let's make it more interesting. Let's go to movies. So Krishna, can I please request you to again participate in this experiment? I'm going to show you a set of movies now. Instead of static images, there are going to be movies. There are going to be 8 movies, and these movies are going to be drifting dots, dots drifting at a certain angle. One of them is going to be different, and you will have to identify which is the odd one. So, are you ready? Can I start my timer?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So 3, 2, 1, and go.
Ready.
Okay. So where's the odd movie?
Top right one on.
So on the right, the topmost one.
Yes.
Right. So yeah, that is the odd movie. So let's repeat this on a different set of movies. I'll show you one more example. Sorry, is there a question?
I think they unmuted themselves.
Okay, okay. So yeah, are you ready for the second set?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So 3, 2, 1, and go.
Ready.
Okay. So where's the odd movie?
Okay. Left one. The third one from top. Okay, I think that
left one, third one from the top. So
yeah,
this one.
Yeah.
Okay. So it turns out it is wrong. It was actually this one, but that is good because I wanted, an example for an error. So that's okay, Krishna. Thank you so much. So the point is that the time to find the odd movie depends on the drifts of the movies. Okay, so perhaps in this example, it is much more clear to appreciate what is the usefulness of having some error and having to keep this error small. Okay, so we saw that live. So the time to find the odd movie, of course, depends on the drifts on what the drifts of the movies are. Now, the closer the drifts of these movies appear to the eyes, the longer it would take to find the odd movie. So just like how Vaidyan et al. Carried out their analysis for static images, can we say that given two movies with drifts D1 and D2, the expected time required to find the odd movie subject to the error probability criterion grows like logarithm of 1 over epsilon. This is just a possibility looking at the literature, looking at some prior work on static images. Is this actually true is the question that we were after. Okay, can we actually nail down what this constant alpha D1, D2 is? So this is going to be the main focus of my talk. Okay, so before we can actually proceed, we first need a model. Okay, so we have this odd movie experiment. We need a model now. We need a model to actually start our analysis. So what's the model? The first thing we notice is that each drifting dots movie is a sequence of frames over time. It can be a 30 FPS movie, a 60 FPS movie. So it's just a sequence of frames over time. So if we were to just lay down these frames over time, so let's say at t equal to 0, there is one frame. If it's a 30 frames per second movie, then every 1/30th of a second, there is a new frame. Okay, I mean, in the sense there are 30 frames in 1 second. Okay, so in all these frames, what is happening is that, look at the odd movie. In the odd movie that is shown on this slide, the dots are drifting from the bottom right corner to the top left corner. Okay, so over time, these dots are all drifting. And at a very simplistic level, what we can say is that our eyes tends to focus on one movie at any given time. This is a very simplistic model. I'll come back to addressing some more sophisticated models later in the talk, towards the end of the talk. But as a first step in the analysis, it is okay to say that our eyes tends to focus on one of these movies at any given time. Now, what happens is that perhaps...
Karthik,
yeah. Yes, sir.
Gugan, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, Karthik, I'm not sure if you prefer asking questions during your talk or you prefer at the end. Any preference?
No, nothing like that. So I had some natural stopping points during the talk. So if it can wait, it's okay. Otherwise, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, my quick question was, say, I'm not able to see a motivation for the problem, right? So you have some problem, I can understand that, but why is this looking at such problems interesting? Maybe a few lines on that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so actually neuroscientists have been trying to understand how is it that humans perceive two different images or two different objects as being different. What is the natural notion of closeness that the human brain tries to associate between two images or between two objects? And this line of study was undertaken by Professor Rajesh Sundareshan's group. There was a student who had done this analysis earlier on static images, and there was a certain natural notion of closeness between these images that actually came up as an answer to this question when they were studying this. And this answer was firmly rooted on a decision theoretic framework. Okay, so there were other notions of distance that were associated earlier that neuroscientists were trying to use in their study of how this visual perception or how images are perceived by humans. So those metrics did not actually have a firm rooting in any theory as such. But for the first time, there was a natural decision theoretic viewpoint to this problem. And what we wanted to do was to extend this analysis to more general settings. So I will tell you more about, I mean, it's not just about this odd movie experiment. There are many, many examples where there is anomaly in a setting like this. So it is interesting to study all those cases. So I'll just touch upon that. Okay.
Thank you. That's enough. Thank you.
Yeah. So so it's possible that these images are observed at some specific times like this, let's say. Now the point is that whenever some of these movies are not observed, they're actually continuing to play. So there is some loss of information that's happening. And somehow the human brain is trying to capture all of this, collate all of this information, and finally trying to arrive at the location of the odd movie. Okay, so if we were to come down to the the fineness in time, the fineness of the rate at which the images are generated in each movie, the frames are generated in each movie, as a first step, we can possibly assume that at these discrete time steps, the human is going to look at one of these movies at any given time, and he's going to observe the positions of the dots in the frame of that movie at that time. He will possibly switch to a different movie. There is a certain position of dots. He will possibly switch to a different movie. There is a certain configuration for the dots and things like that. He keeps moving. He keeps observing these dots. He keeps collecting the observations. And eventually, he's going to make his decision on what the odd movie is. So as a first step, what we do is we will try to model this particular scenario as a multi-arm bandit problem. Okay, this is a natural model for decision making under uncertainty. Okay, so how is this mapping made? What is the connection between the odd movie experiment and the multi-arm bandits? So a movie for us is like an arm. Okay, now what is a movie? A movie is a sequence of frames over time. As I said, this is just like saying that an arm is like a sequence of observations over time. An arm yields a sequence of observations over time. It's like a process. Okay. Now the positions of the dots in any two successive frames of a particular movie depend on each other because there is a drift. You can see that clearly in the illustration that I have shown at the bottom of this slide. So what can we say about this in the multi-arm bandit setting? Well, we can say that the observations are Markovian. Okay. And typically one movie is observed at any given time. That is like saying that one arm is sampled at any given time. Okay. And then the unobserved movies continue to play. Observe that in this particular experiment. This is the most important aspect of the problem. This is not the case in static images. In static images, the images are just, they are static. But when it comes to movies, there is a certain loss of information, and this needs to be captured carefully. Okay. So the unobserved mode is continuing to play in the multi-arm bandit setting, in the setting of Markov observations, is what is known as the setting of restless arms. Now, the drift in one of the movies being different from the drift of all the other movies, which is the anomaly in this problem, is analogous to saying that the transition probability matrix of one of the Markov processes is different. Okay, so combining all of these ideas together, this is what we call the odd restless Markov arm problem. This is an abstraction of the experiment that we saw. This is the model that we are going to carry forward to analyze. Of course, there may be a lot of simplifications in this model. I will come to address those towards the end of the talk. Okay. So what is the model that we are going to look at? We have a multi-arm bandit with at least 3 arms. If there are at least 3 arms, then the notion of odd arm will make sense. Okay. Now, each arm for us is going to be a time homogeneous and an ergodic Markov process. Okay, so these are some nice conditions that we impose so that the problem becomes amenable to analysis. The Markov processes are all assumed to evolve on a common finite state space. For example, in the case of the odd movie experiment, this finite state space could be, for example, the 8-bit representation of each frame. Okay, there are 256 possible values for each frame. It could be an 8-bit representation as an example. Now, what is the anomaly? The anomaly is that the transition probability matrix of one of the arms, which henceforth we are going to call the odd arm, is, let's say, P1. It's some P1. The transition probability matrix of all the other arms is some different P2. P2 and P1 are different from each other. Okay. Importantly, the arms are restless, which means that the unobserved arms will continue to evolve. You can keep in mind the example of movies continuing to play even though they are not observed. And finally, these TPMs P1 and P2 may be known or may not be known beforehand. Okay, so this is the general setup. We are going to address this problem at different levels. Okay, so this is the first level. This is the problem that we want to attack now. Okay, this is our first step towards trying to understand what exactly is happening in the odd movie experiment. Can we provide an analysis of that along the lines of what Vaidyan et al. Have done? So the goal for us will be to characterize this very important quantity. Okay. We anticipate that this growth rate is going to be log 1 over epsilon. That is, denominator log 1 over epsilon is something that we anticipate. It has to be seen whether this is actually true. Okay, and without giving any, without keeping any surprises, the answer is that yes. The answer is yes. It is logarithm of 1 over epsilon, and I'm going to show you how and why. Okay, so it turns out that this restless setting is very challenging, primarily because of the fact that the unobserved arms continue to evolve. In other words, because the movies are continuing to play, it is somewhat a slightly difficult scenario to analyze. Now, imagine a slightly simpler scenario where we were to pause each movie before leaving that movie and observing some other movie. Okay, that is a slightly simpler setting to understand. It may not have direct practical implications, but it is something that will help us in coming, in analyzing this more difficult problem. Okay, so imagine a particular, the scenario where when you are switching between movies, just like how the volunteer Krishna did, when switching between movies, unobserved movies were continuing to play. There was no control in that experiment that I showed. But imagine for a moment that there is some control. We can pause a movie before leaving it and going to observe another movie. We play that movie for how long we want to observe it. We pause it and then switch to another movie, and we play the movie that we observe there. Okay, so this is a slightly simpler model, which will help us analyze this more difficult problem where all the movies continue to play. Okay, so this simpler model of pausing the movies is what is called in the multi-arm bandit setting as the arms being rested. Okay, everything else is same as on the previous slide, except that the one in blue is different. Okay, I'm saying that the arms are rested, which means they don't evolve unless and until they are played. The movies don't evolve unless and until they are played. In other words, the arms don't evolve unless and until they are observed. Okay, so this is, as I said, simpler to analyze, and it will form a first step for us before analyzing the more difficult problem of all movies continuing to evolve. Okay, so just to put this problem in perspective, when we think of multi-arm bandits, typically there is this notion of reward maximization or regret minimization. Okay, there the goal is to be able to do an exploration versus exploitation trade-off and acquire rewards in such a way that the overall reward after a certain units of time, either a finite horizon or an infinite horizon. That is typically the case, for example, in clinical trials, which was the motivation for multi-arm bandits. But if you were to imagine a scenario like a cosmetics producing company, for example, okay, when they are actually manufacturing the product, they don't really care about the rewards. All that they care about is they want to give out a recommendation at the end of this exercise. They want to give out a recommendation to the customers and make sure that that product clicks. Okay, so it is about recommending the best possible product in such a case. So the terminal decision is what is very important in such cases, not the reward that is accumulated through the process. Okay, so it's not the perspective of reward maximization, but on the converse, it is what is called optimal stopping. Okay, optimal stopping is about searching optimally and stopping and giving out a recommendation, the best possible recommendation. So all of these comes under sequential hypothesis testing. This is a very broad umbrella. It's all about, it comes under the purview of sequential hypothesis testing. In particular, it's about active sequential hypothesis testing. Active simply means that we have the option to choose which movie we want to observe, which image we want to observe, or which arm we want to select at each time. So that is the active part of this active sequential hypothesis testing. There come the classical works of Chernoff and Albert. Under active sequential hypothesis testing, there are many variants, many problems that one can actually imagine, out of which odd arm identification is one branch, which I'm showing here. Under odd arm identification, one could possibly think of IID observations from the arms or Markov observations from the arms. In fact, the analysis that was carried out by Vaidyan et al. That I showed on static images concerns IID observations from the arms. Okay, we are going to now extend it to movies which are Markovian. Okay, so our results come here. It may be a very small branch, nevertheless, it's an important branch. And these are the leaves. I mean, these are the results of our work, just to put our work in perspective. Okay, so I'm going to speak about some of these works towards the end of the talk, as how our work can fit within these broad frameworks and could possibly be generalized to these higher levels as well. Okay, so this is, I think, a natural stopping point, because next I'm going to start with the analysis of the rested arms setting. That is when the movies are paused. I'm going to provide an analysis to that, and I'm going to lift the ideas to analyze the setting of all movies continuing to play. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take at this moment, else we can proceed.
Maybe you should continue. We are running a little short of time.
Okay, sure, yeah. So as I said, this is the odd rested Markov arm problem. The setting is, so what we do is, in this setting, we assume that the transition probability matrices are not known. In other words, we don't know what the movies that are going to be shown to us are. It's just that there is a pause, etc. But a priori, we are not told what the movies are. So this is the case of unknown TPMs. Okay, the case of the simpler setting of known TPMs is turns out it's a straightforward extension from the analysis for Vaidyan et al. So we are not going to focus on that. Okay, so what are our contributions here? Very briefly, I'll put down the contributions. So on this slide, I have shown a small image. As I said, each arm for us will be a sequence of frames over time. One of the arms is odd, that is marked in green color here. Its TPM is going to be P1. All the other arms, TPM is going to be P2. We will call this a problem instance or an arms configuration. Okay, so this is a triplet. It consists of the odd arm location H. In this example, in this image, H is 3. P1 is the TPM of arm H, and P2 is the TPM of each non-odd arm H. Okay, so we are going to first present a lower bound. Okay, so we are going to show that the growth rate is indeed logarithm of 1 over epsilon. The stopping time grows as logarithm of 1 over epsilon, and the growth rate is captured by this constant d star, which is given here. Okay, I'm going to spell out some details about what this constant is. Also, we give a policy which achieves this lower bound. Okay, so our result is that this is the exact growth rate. This lower bound is in fact tight. Okay, so as we proceed, first we will try to understand what is the setting of rested arms. Okay, so here I'm going to show you an illustration. Let's say first each of the arms is picked once. Okay, so notice that the subscript 0 is there everywhere. It means that arm's observation is obtained only when that arm is selected. So the first observation is obtained when the arms are selected for the first time. Okay, now at time t equal to 4, arm 3 is selected, and notice how the next observation there is obtained. Only when an arm is selected, observation is obtained. Now, if we switch to a different arm, at that time, a new observation from that arm is obtained. Okay. Similarly, from arm 1, similarly from arm 3, and arm 4. Okay. So that arm is going to tick only when we select that arm. Okay. So now, if arm A, if up to a certain time n, arm A is sampled, let's say NA of n times, what is the history we have with us up to time n? It is all the actions that we have taken, that is all the arms that we have selected up to time n, and all the observations that we obtain. These observations are going to be indexed in time from 0 to n minus 1. Okay, so 0 to n1 of n minus 1 is from arm 1, 0 to nk of n minus 1 is from arm k. Now, under a configuration C, the most important quantity that we start our analysis with is this log likelihood. Okay, the logarithm of the likelihood of all the actions, all the observations that we have seen under a particular configuration. Okay, remember that this configuration is not known. We are assuming that the TPMs are not known. Anyway, the odd arm location is not known, and that is what we are interested in finding. So C is not known to us. Okay, now here on this slide, the reason why I have put these expressions is to indicate that when we write down the log likelihood, the most natural quantity that appears in the analysis is the probability of transitioning from one state to another for each arm. So on arm 3, for example, I have shown here, I have indicated 3 transitions. Okay, whenever there is a transition from this state to this state, let's say this is an I and this is a J, there is a P1, because the transition probability matrix of this is P1. There will be a P1 of J given I. This is the probability of transitioning from I to J. Such a term will appear in the log likelihood. And how many times will that appear? Well, it will appear as many times as there is an I to J transition observed on the odd arm. In this case, arm number 3. H is 3 in this case. Similarly, there will be I to J transitions on all the other arms. There is a P2 corresponding to each of those I to J transitions. Okay. Now, the point is that only the first 2 terms in the summations in blue and red actually matter. This last part actually doesn't depend upon the P1 and the P2 at all. Okay, that is the point to note. And the reason I brought this up on this slide is just to tell that among all the natural quantities that are going to appear are I to J transitions and the probabilities of those transitions. Okay, so what are the key ideas here? Well, let's try to look at this particular arm number 3. Okay, corresponding to the states, corresponding to the intermediate states here, it turns out that every transition into that state is matched by a transition out of that state. Correct? Similarly, there is a transition into this state and a transition out of this state. Now, this is true for all the intermediate states. except for the first state and the last state. Correct? Except for the first state and the last state. For the first state, what happens is that the number of transitions from will be one more than the number of transitions into. And for the last state, the number of transitions into is going to be one more than the number of transitions from. So what we can say is that the number of transitions to and from are at most in a difference of plus or minus 1. But what is more important is that because all our analysis is in the limit as epsilon, that is the probability of error goes to 0, which is same as saying that n goes to infinity. When we divide by n, this plus minus 1 doesn't matter. The long-term fraction of entries into any state is equal to the long-term fraction of exits from that state. And what are these fractions in turn equal to? This is the most important part. These are both equal to the stationary distribution, the probability of observing that particular state I under the arm's stationary distribution. For example, under arm 3, it will be the stationary distribution of P1. Okay, this probability is this fraction is going to be, let's say, mu1 of I, where mu1 is the stationary distribution associated with P1. Okay, and for all the other arms, it is going to be mu2. So that is how the stationary distributions are going to enter. Just keep this in mind. Okay, I'll get back to this now. Okay, so now what are the ideas? So with using these log likelihood ratios, if we take any policy pi, okay, and if we look at the expected value of the log likelihood ratio between any two different configurations, okay, so we don't know what the true configuration is. Keeping C as a reference configuration and C prime as an alternative configuration, if we were to write down the log likelihood ratio between these two processes up to a certain stopping time of a policy, then it turns out that this can be upper bounded as shown here. Okay, D star is a constant that I'm going to describe soon. Okay, so this upper bound comes as an information theoretic bottleneck. Okay, there is a certain maximum amount of discrimination that we can carry out per unit time between the configurations C and C prime. Remember that our policy is trying to identify the true configuration. So it has to discriminate against all the alternative incorrect configurations. Okay, so this is the information theoretic bottleneck that is an upper bound. Now, also, what we want our policy to satisfy is an error probability criterion. Remember, this means that under the configuration C, it has to output the decision as H with probability at least 1 minus epsilon. And if there is some arm H prime not equal to H, that is an incorrect one. And the decision of the decision for this should have a probability of at most epsilon. Similarly, for all the other arms other than H. Under configuration H prime, well, the policy does not know what the true configuration is. It better work for all configurations. So under the configuration H prime, it has to put probability at least 1 minus epsilon on H prime and a probability of at most epsilon on all the other arms. Okay, now it turns out this particular condition can be captured as a lower bound on the expected value of the log likelihood ratio, and that comes as a data processing inequality. So combining both of these is where we arrive at the lower bound. Okay. Now, what is the constant D star? So among the four arms, P1 is the odd arm and it is arm number 3. Arm number 3 is the odd arm and P1 is its transition probability matrix. Now, what are the possible alternative configurations to this configuration? They are these. Okay, the location of the odd arm can be any one amongst the other 3, that is arm 1, arm 2, or arm 3, and the transition probability matrices of these are P1 prime and P2 prime, accordingly whether they are odd or non-odd. Okay, it turns out there are so many possible configurations like this. You can vary the P1 prime and P2 prime and generate uncountably many possible configurations. But if the policy has to identify C as the true configuration, if at all C is the true configuration, as I have shown on this image, if C is the true configuration and if the policy has to identify the true configuration with a high accuracy, it turns out we need not battle against all the configurations. There is one very difficult configuration, and that is given by this particular choice of P1 prime and P2 prime. Okay, it has to battle against this particular configuration. I have not spelled out the details of what the exact expression for P2 prime is, but it turns out this is the most difficult and nearest alternative configuration that needs to be battled against. And the amount of effort that is required to battle against this nearest alternative is what constant D star captures. Okay. Here, lambda is the probability distribution on the arms. Okay, so now let's see if we can get to this lower bound. We gave a lower bound fine. Is that lower bound tight is the question. How do we get to the lower bound? Now, it turns out that for each HP1, P2, each configuration, this maximum over lambda is attained by a unique lambda. There is a unique lambda star which attains the maximum. And of course, this lambda star could possibly depend on H, P1 and P2. Okay, so we have this. Unfortunately, we don't know H, P1, P2. What do we need to do? We just need to estimate these quantities as we go along the way. As we keep accumulating more and more observations, we need to estimate these. Now, one important property that we want out of our estimation procedure is that as the estimates get closer and closer to the true configuration, we would ideally like to sample the arms according to what is the optimal distribution according to which the arms must be sampled. Remember that in order to reach this constant D star, it is very important to sample the arms according to the optimal lambda star that attains this maximum. Okay, so it is very important that the arms actually be sampled according to this optimum lambda star, which of course depends on HP1, P2, but we don't know that. Our hope is that in the process of applying this distribution on the estimated configuration, we will eventually reach the optimal distribution according to which the arms must be sampled. Okay, and this particular property is achieved. This property is satisfied thanks to what is known as Burgess maximum theorem. In other words, what we are saying is that this mapping is continuous, and therefore, if the estimates are very close to the true configuration, the lambda stars will also be close to each other. Okay, so a little more details on what how these estimates are done. We impose a certain prior, and then so because the transition probability matrices are not known, we impose a prior on the space of transition probability matrices, and we pick two transition probability matrices independently according to this prior, and then we construct an average likelihood, which is just the likelihood averaged across with respect to this prior. And then there is, of course, a maximum likelihood that we can estimate. And then we construct this statistic, which is the average likelihood by maximum likelihood. I missed a logarithm of this. Please excuse me. So there's a logarithm of average likelihood by maximum likelihood. Okay. And what we do is that we estimate H at as this particular quantity here. So this says that the nearest alternative. So this is based on the property that the nearest alternative described by min over H prime should be kept as far away as possible. That is max over H. Okay, so for this quantity, the nearest alternative should be kept as far away as possible. So we try to select an arm in that way. And it turns out that p hats have closed form expressions in this case. They are just the empirical fraction of times I to j transitions are observed on what we think is the odd arm. So H hat is our guess of what the odd arm location is. And this particular quantity is our guess of what the TPM of our guess of the odd arm is. And similarly, the TPM of all the non-odd arms is p hat 2. Okay, so it turns out there are simple closed form expressions in this case. And our policy will use all of these ideas. What it will do is it will first select all the arms once, and it will estimate H hat at each stage, and it will check whether the nearest alternative to what we think as the odd arm is sufficiently separated in its statistic from all the other arms. That is, if it has exceeded a certain fixed threshold, k minus 1 into L. Okay, so our policy is named pi star L delta. There are two parameters. I'm going to tell you what those two parameters are shortly. So if it exceeds a certain threshold, we are going to stop. We are confident because its statistic is sufficiently separated. So we are confident we are going to stop, and we are going to declare H hat as the odd arm. Otherwise, we are going to toss a coin with probability delta. If the coin lands heads, we are going to sample an arm uniformly. If the coin lands tails, we are going to sample according to what is the optimal distribution for what we think is the true configuration. Okay, so this is what is called the principle of certainty equivalence in the literature. It is important to understand why it's not okay. I mean, why it is, why not have a simple policy that simply repeatedly samples the arms in order to estimate the transition probability matrices? So this is one question that I used to get very repeatedly. So the simple answer to that is that we want this property to be satisfied. That is, we want to sample the arms according to the optimal distribution for the true configuration eventually. That is, eventually we want to sample the arms in an optimal fashion. Not just that, we also want to ensure that our policy satisfies the desired error probability. It turns out policies which sample the arms repeatedly, although they yield very simple expressions for the estimates of the transition matrices, it's quite difficult to show that they satisfy the desired error probability. Okay, so recall that the lower bound relies on the fact that we are in this space, that is the space of all policies whose probability of error is at most epsilon. So this is the quantity that is very important, and in order to ensure that this is satisfied is where all the effort goes. Okay, so Karthik, what is the performance?
A quick time check. You have another 20 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So what we are able to show in this case is that our policy is going to stop in finite time. We have that our true odd arm is actually identified with probability 1. And then the estimates, of course, converge to the true values. There are simple closed form expressions that I showed you for the estimates. Ergodic theorem guarantees this particular convergence. Now, the parameter L can be set depending on what the error probability we desire is. So if epsilon is what we desire, if we set L equal to 1 over epsilon, then our policy is going to satisfy the desired error probability. Also, our policy is going to satisfy a certain upper bound, which in the limit as delta goes to 0 matches with the lower bound. So delta is a parameter that we can tune to make the upper bound as arbitrarily close to the lower bound as we require it. Okay. So combining with the lower bound, we have this final result here. Okay. So this is as far as the setting of rested arms is concerned. Okay. So I will now lift this analysis to the setting of restless arms. Let's see how that can be done. So here, first we start with the setting that the TPMs are known beforehand. Let's first, in other words, what I'm saying is we know what movies we are going to be shown, and we have to identify where the odd movie is. Okay. So again, as I said, we want to characterize this growth rate. We anticipate it is still logarithm of 1 over epsilon, even in the restless case. Now it turns out, even here we give similar contributions. We show that the growth rate is indeed logarithm of 1 over epsilon. The scaling factor is what is shown as R star here. I'll come to what this constant is. And we also give a policy, and therefore this growth rate is tight. Okay. So in these visual search experiments, what happens is that often the actual focus location differs from the intended focus location with a small probability. Okay. So if the actual focus location is, let's say, AT, and the intended focus location is BT, this particular phenomenon of the actual focus location and the intended focus location differing can be captured as a trembling hand. Okay, so AT and BT are equal with a high probability, and AT is uniformly randomly chosen with a probability of eta. So eta here is what is called a trembling hand parameter. Okay, so in visual search experiments, this is often the case. Okay, so let's see what happens in the restless case. Okay, so in the restless case, this is a demonstration. So let's say each arm is sampled once. Notice how the indices have changed now. We have already moved forward on arm 2 because the first observation was not obtained. The arm actually evolved. The arm evolved. We did not sample arm 2 at time 0. So it actually evolved. So notice how the indices have changed. Now, starting at time 4, we can possibly ask what is the delay of each arm and the last observed state of each arm. So this delay is the most important characteristic in restless setting. It captures how far back in time each arm was observed, because we are losing information, right? We need to keep track of this time. Okay. So in reference to time t equal to 4, arm 1 was observed 4 time instants back. So its delay is 4. In reference to time t equal to 4, arm 2 was observed 3 time instants back. So its delay is 3, and so on. We can also see what is the last observed state. Okay. So now let's say arm 3 is sampled. The delays can be updated like this. The delays of all the unobserved arms are going to get incremented by 1. The delay of the observed arm is going to be 1. Okay, and the last observed states of the other arms don't change. Only the arm that we observe is going to change, and it will be updated accordingly. So in this way, we can keep updating the delays and the last observed states. The most important point to observe is that at any given point of time, the delay of exactly one of the arms is equal to 1. All the other arms, it is strictly greater than 1. Okay, this just means we can observe only one arm at any given time. Okay, so again, as I said, just like in the rested setting, the most important quantity in analysis for us will be the log likelihood ratio, log likelihood. Okay, so here what happens is, because the transitions still happen, from I to J transitions happen, but because there will be some time for which we would not have observed the arms, these transitions are going to happen at a certain delay, after a certain time gap. So those are what naturally come in the log likelihood. Okay. So NH of NDIJ simply means what is the number of times that arm H was sampled, a transition from state I to state J was observed, and that transition took place D time instants apart. Okay, and this is multiplied by the logarithm of the probability of such a transition happening, which is P1 raised to the power D now. So powers of transition matrices will start coming in. Okay, so in order to better appreciate what is the importance of this delay and how it enters into the analysis, here is a quick demonstration. So let's say there are 4 arms. So in this demonstration, the y-axis is the time and x-axis is the arms. Okay. So I have picked ARM3 as a specific example, and there are some transitions that I have shown, and these transitions happen with certain delays. Okay, so let's say that NA of NDI is simply the number of times ARM A was sampled. A transition from state I was observed, and that transition happened D time instance later. We don't know. It was to some state, but definitely we know transition happened from state I. Okay, so this is one of the most important equations that governs ARM delays. What is this trying to say? It is just as simple as this. What is the first term? A minus 1. That covers the first two time instance. Now the second term here captures the fact that for every delay, we are going to count those many time instants into the future. Okay, so there is a delay. There is a delay of 3. There is a delay of 3. There is a delay of 2 at the end. So it captures all the time instants that have passed from 0 to n minus 1. That is totally n time instants. And that is what is there on the right-hand side of this equation. Okay, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that if we take limits as n goes to infinity, the long-term fraction of times we observe a transition from state I, and that transition happening after D time instance has to satisfy this important equation. Okay, so as usual, like before, we carry out our analysis. We write down the log likelihood ratio between two different configurations. In this case, the configuration has P1 and P2 intact because we know P1 and P2. The only change will be in the H prime, in the H variable. Okay, so it turns out that the upper bound will be in terms of a constant R star, which satisfies this particular equation. So here kappa, if you recognize, is the long-term fraction of times a transition from state I is observed on ARM A, and that transition happened D time instance into the future. Okay, so this is, I think, familiar. You recognize it from the previous slide. And of course, it is a long-term fraction. So when summed up across all the variables, it should add up to 1. Now, the point is that we captured one constraint corresponding to ARM delays on the previous slide. But how do we know there are no more constraints? How do we know we have captured the tightest set of constraints? Somehow this doesn't seem very natural. Okay, so what we do is we abandon this particular approach. The reason why I told this is focusing on the delays and last observed states of only one of the arms at a time, like we did in the rested case, is not enough. We need a more global perspective. Okay, that global perspective is looking at delays of all the arms together. Okay, so if we were to collect all the delays and all the last observed states at each time instant, and if we were to look at the history up to a certain time, B0 denotes the intended arm, A0 is the actual arm, X0, A0 is the observation from the actual arm. Okay, so if we look at this entire history can be captured in terms of the delays and the last observed states and also the intended actions. Okay, so it turns out, so why is this important? Why is collecting all the delays and all the last observed states important? That is because this process happens to be a controlled Markov process with controls as BT. So our convention is that given the controls B0 to BT minus 1 and all the delays up to a certain time, the next action BT is going, the next control or the next action or the next arm BT is going to be sampled. Thereafter, the state of the system is going to be updated to DT plus 1, IT plus 1. Okay, so a controlled Markov chain simply means to determine the value of DT plus 1, IT plus 1 given the controls and given the history, we can throw out the history and we can retain only the last observed state, the latest state of the system, which is DT-IT. Okay, so we therefore have a Markov decision problem. Okay, now we are in business because there is something naturally that is getting captured in this Markov decision problem. So there is the state space is the space of all possible delays and last observed states of all the arms collected together. The action space is the set of arms. State at time t is DT-IT, the delay last observed states as observed at that time, and the action is BT. However, our objective is to characterize this quantity. Let's keep that in mind. It's not to maximize rewards like that is typical in MDPs. Okay, so we have these MDP transition probabilities. In the interest of time, I'm not going to explain how these transition probabilities can be computed. They can be computed in a certain fashion. Okay, recognize this particular term, which is important. This is thanks to the trembling hand. Okay, we actually want to select BT equal to B, but AT equal to 1 ends up getting selected because the hand is trembled. Okay, so let's recognize that fact, number one. Number two, let's recognize the fact that there is the dependence on the transition probability matrix here. There is a fourth power which is coming in this particular example calculation. So we will denote the transition probabilities as Q. Okay, So here on this slide, I had another example to demonstrate transition probabilities. Again, the important points to note are the dependence on this transition on the trembling hand parameter and the transition probability matrix. Okay, so as usual, we will carry out the analysis, writing down the log likelihood ratios. Now, in this case, when we do this, the upper bound, it turns out there is a constant which is different now. It is R star. What is R star? R star is, again, it is guarding against the nearest alternative. It has a very similar interpretation, but notice the underlying D and the underlying A. That is the perspective of taking the delays and last observed states of all the arms together. Okay, the specific form is not important. The point is that this somehow captures all the constraints very naturally because it is in an NDP setting. And as before, this is an information theoretic bottleneck, and that is a data processing inequality, and this is our lower bound. Okay, so in order to explain more about what this constant R star is, it turns out that there is a simplification we can do for R star, and that comes from what are called SRS policies. Okay, so remember how I said, depending on the entire history up to a certain time, we are going to select BT. Now there are various ways of selecting BT. If BT is selected in this particular fashion, that is, depending on the entire history, I'm going to select BT only based on the current state according to a certain fixed conditional probability distribution on the arms, which I denote as lambda. Lambda is fixed. Lambda is not going to change throughout. Okay, so if I continuously keep picking according to this kind of a conditional distribution, then such a policy is what is called an SRS policy. And such a policy will be explicitly denoted as pi lambda. Okay, so let pi SRS be the set of all SRS policies. Now comes the most important part. Okay, so it turns out that under any SRS policy, this DTIT process, which was actually a controlled Markov process, remember, it was controlled by the controls BTs. So this control Markov process actually happens to be a Markov process itself. That is thanks to the stationary controls that are applied at every given time based on the distribution lambda. Now, thanks to the trembling hand model, this Markov process turns out to be ergodic. That is, it will have a single recurrent class. Notice that its state space is countably infinite, yet it is positive recurrent. It's irreducible, aperiodic, all of this. Okay. So which means if it is ergodic, it means that there is a stationary distribution for this. Once we have a stationary distribution, once we have the trembling hand model, we can write down the ergodic state action occupancy measures. And it turns out from a standard result on controlled Markov chains that this supremum over all possible state action occupancy measures can be replaced by a supremum over ergodic state action occupancy measures. That is the most important step in the analysis. And then it's, however, difficult to show that this supremum is attained because it will involve a search over all conditional probability distributions and all SRS policies. So what we do is we don't intend to attain the supremum. We can try to come as close as possible to the supremum by, let's say, tuning a certain parameter. By tuning that parameter and letting the parameter go to 0, we can eventually reach the supremum. That is the idea. So, okay, so the computability of the supremum is actually an issue. And then under a certain configuration, we only look at delta optimal solutions. We don't have to reach the supremum. It's okay if we come as close as supremum by 1 plus delta. Okay, so we combine all these ideas, and it's a very similar policy. Once we have understood the rested setting, it's a very similar policy. And what we actually show is that the odd arm is eventually identified almost surely. And then same as before. If L is 1 by epsilon, our policy satisfies the desired error probability, and delta is a parameter which will help us get to as close as 1 plus delta by R star as the upper bound. Now, delta, of course, can be tuned, and if we can let delta go to 0, we will get to the lower bound, which was 1 by R star. So, combining all the results, this is our final result for the setting of restless arms when the TPMs are known. The final stage is when the TPMs are not known. The only challenge here is the TPMs are not known. The rest of the analysis can be borrowed from before. So again, our contributions are similar. Okay, in this case, however, it turns out that showing the upper bound is a little difficult for all possible arms configurations. We will require some assumptions in the analysis. So under a certain continuous selection assumption and a certain regularity assumption, we are able to show the upper bound. Okay, so our lower bound will hold for all configurations, same as in the restless settings that we saw earlier and the rested setting we saw earlier. However, the upper bound is for a subset of arms configurations which satisfy some assumptions. We will see why these assumptions are important. Okay, so our final answer would be this. So it is the same as before. recall this slide where I told you that the transition probabilities depend on the underlying transition probability matrices. In the earlier case, P1 and P2 were known, so we could explicitly compute this. However, in this case, P1 and P2 are not known. Okay, so P1 and P2 and also the odd arm location H, all the three of them are going to characterize or are going to parameterize these transition probabilities. Okay, and the true value of this parameter, which means the true arms configuration, is not known and it must be learned along the way. That is the most important part. So notice also that the set of all possible arms configurations is uncountably infinite. Okay, so the analysis is same as before. The converse result follows from the information theoretic bottleneck and the data processing inequality, and there is a certain natural lower bound. So this is again guarding against the nearest alternative, just that in this case, earlier there was only H prime not equal to H because P1 and P2 were known. In this case, we are also going to vary P1 and P2. Okay. Again, as before, we don't have exact attainability of the supremum, so we look for delta optimal solutions. That is enough actually, but the point is that there can be more than one delta optimal solution in this case, and because the parameter space is uncountably infinite, we need to swim through it very carefully. Okay, for each arms configuration, there is a set of delta optimal solutions, many delta optimal solutions. Let's say we pick one of those. Okay, and for a different arms configuration, there are a different set of delta optimal solutions. So let's say we have a certain selection of delta optimal solutions with this. Okay, as before, we would like to have this property. What is the property? As we come closer and closer to estimating the true configuration, ideally we would like to sample the arms according to the true distribution. But however, this may not be the case when there are so many possibilities for the delta optimal solutions. Okay, so this is where we impose our first assumption that there is actually a regularity on the delta optimal solutions in terms of continuity. And there is another assumption that we impose under which we actually try to show the results, which is that we assume, so as I said, our upper bound, our achievability is not for all configurations. We are able to demonstrate achievability for a subset of configurations which satisfy this particular property. That is, P and Q belong to this class of all transition probability matrices that are ergodic and all of whose entries are strictly greater than some epsilon star. Even the powers of those are strictly greater than epsilon star. This is a natural class. Every transition probability matrix will belong to a class like this for some epsilon star, which will depend on the matrix. So what I'm trying to say is, if you take any transition probability matrix P, it will naturally belong to a P of epsilon bar star for some epsilon bar star, which will depend on the P. Okay, but what we want is a uniformity across many such transition probability matrices. Okay, it turns out this actually makes the problem of identifying the odd arm hard. In other words, we're actually trying to focus on a set of configurations for which it is harder to distinguish between the transition probability matrices. And the reason I say that is, if you take any two transition probability matrices and look at the KL divergence between the rows of the transition probability matrices, it can lie anywhere between 0 and infinity. But if P and Q are restricted to the class P of epsilon bar star, their KL divergence can be at most logarithm 1 over epsilon bar star. So they cannot be arbitrarily separated. So this makes the problem a little hard. Okay, under these conditions, we actually try to show, we devise a policy very similar to before. There are not many changes. We just recognize the principle of certainty equivalence whenever the underlying configuration is not known, just like in the rested case. And here, under these assumptions, we are able to show identifiability. The most important part to note here is that we don't have closed form expressions for the ML estimates. Still, we are able to show identifiability. We just know that they exist. We are able to show identifiability. So these are some issues that I will come to addressing very shortly now. Okay, so in a nutshell, these are the results: rested, restless known, restless unknown. Okay, very quickly, I will go over some key ideas for future work, or what actually made us, what actually helped us solve these problems. So I have already put down the key ideas for all of these. In the first case, we recognized that there is an invariant quantity, which is the fraction of exits, fraction of transitions from, fraction of transitions to. Those are the invariant quantities. In the restless known case, we had to lift the idea and we had to consider the delays and last observed states of all the arms together, not just one particular arm. And in the last case, we wanted to show identifiability. In order to show identifiability, we had to impose certain natural assumptions on the transition probability matrices and on the delta optimal solutions. Now, we considered the case when there is a trembling hand, but what if there is no trembling hand? Okay, let's quickly walk through this. So we showed that this is how the upper and lower bounds look like in the restless case. I'm considering the case when P1 and P2 are known, so that this is a simpler setting to explain. Okay, so we showed that the upper and lower bounds, they explicitly depend on eta. See, there is eta in this expression. So let's explicitly write down R eta star. Okay, and we know that the upper and the lower bounds match from our analysis. Now, what happens as eta goes to 0 is what we want to ask. Okay, so it turns out that as eta becomes smaller and smaller, this R eta star becomes larger and larger. Okay, so there is a monotonicity property, and therefore limit definitely exists. But all that we don't know is that is this limit finite or infinite. Okay, also let's just plug in eta equal to 0 here and get another expression, which is what I call R0 star. Ideally, we would like to have both of these equal. Are these equal is the question. We are able to show that in the IID setting, that is, this is the analysis by Vaidyan et al. And this is the rested arm setting I showed you at the beginning. In these cases, this answer is yes, thanks to the envelope theorem. Okay, that is, if we were to apply the trembling hand model there, it turns out that the answer is yes, this limit matches. However, for the setting of restless arms, all we are able to show is this, it is less than or equal to. In other words, the lower bound and the upper bound are like this. We don't know whether they match. All we know is that this is limit is less than or equal to this. That is 1 by this is less than or equal to 1 by this. If you are able to establish, if you are able to resolve an envelope theorem in this case, then I think there is equality here. Okay, so this is where we stand. It's a good problem to attack, I feel. And then there is computability of R star, as I said, because there is a supremum over all conditional distributions, and because the arm delays are countably infinite valued, these are complicated objects to deal with. Possibly Q-learning for restless bandits, something of the kind that Avrenchikov and Borkar show in this paper may be needed. And in practice, we may want to say that the delays are restricted to some large value. Okay, if an arm is not observed for a very long period of time, let's go and observe that. Let's forcefully go and observe that. But in such a case, showing ergodicity will become a problem. Okay, so these are some challenges that will be encountered when in the analysis. And then, of course, what we have characterized is the first order term. What we are saying is in our answer is this. This is one equation that you will have to take away from this talk, if at all there is a takeaway. It means to the first order, it is something like this. But can we say what are the higher order terms? Okay, is there a G such that an equation like this holds? If so, what is the interpretation of this constant beta? We already saw what is the interpretation of alpha. Alpha denotes, alpha is the effort required to guard against the nearest alternative. Okay, so what would be beta? And we can, of course, consider switching costs, switching between movies, switching between images, switching between the arms. We have not considered any cost in our work. Possibly switching costs can be incorporated. Now, of course, we know that our eyes are capable of grasping a lot of images at once and processing those images and not really looking at one particular image at a given time. How do we bring in those kind of sophisticated visual search models into this problem? And what if the person who is carrying out this experiment is not able to remember all the actions, all the observations that he has seen up to a certain time, the entire history? What if his memory is constrained to store only the last, let's say, capital T time units of information? In that case, how will this analysis change? Okay, and then more general sequential hypothesis testing problems can be addressed. So there is already one line of work on this in the context of IID observations from the arms. Okay, can this possibly be extended to Markov observations is the question. And then I have not considered hidden Markov models. All the observations for me are noiseless. Could possibly hidden Markov models be brought in? That is one interesting line of work. Okay, and I would like to acknowledge all of these sources for providing the scholarship that I got during my PhD. And my heartfelt thanks to all of these professors. Professor Rajesh, my advisor, I think I owe a lot of thanks to him. I've interacted a lot with most of all of these professors, and they were very kind to help me. They were very kind to welcome me into their labs, into their offices, and discuss with me very openly. I could very openly share whatever difficulties I was facing during my PhD with Professor Naveen Kashyap and Himanshu Tyagi, who were on my annual progress review committee and also in my comprehensive exam panel. I thank all of them. And I can't forget my student friends who helped me a lot. I've bugged many of them at many times, be it asking them about whether my proof is okay, whether this idea would work, or what they think should be the most common, most natural approach to take in a particular scenario. So I bugged all of them. I really express my heartfelt thanks to all of them. And if there is one takeaway, possibly it is this. In the rested arms setting, our analysis of the rested arms setting told us to look for invariant quantities. Okay, conservation of mass, conservation of energy. These are all very old ideas, but very profound ideas which made a lot of impact. So possibly one of the most important things while carrying out analysis should be to look for invariant quantities, is what the setting of rested arms has taught me. The setting of restless arms taught me that it is a difficult problem. First, go and solve a simpler problem and lift the ideas to put the more difficult setting. And finally, the last setting, which is actually what we wanted to solve when we started off, taught me that it is extremely important to search for the right keyword. And the right keyword I was looking for is identifiability, which is another way of saying that ML estimates converge to their true values. Okay, but it was this word that actually troubled me for more than 7 or 8 months. So I think it is very important to identify the right keywords when looking up literature, and also while writing. So I think with this I will conclude. Thanks.
Thank you, Karthik. The forum is now open for questions. Gugan has raised his hand. Gugan, go ahead.
Yeah, hi Karthik. So nice talk. So I had 2 questions. See, the first is that you consider the case where you know these transition probability matrices, right? And the
Yes.
next is where you don't know. So intuitively, I feel that the case with transition probability matrices should be easier, right? So in particular, the
Correct.
expected time to, this tau pi thing should be in some sense be smaller than the case where the transition probability matrices are not known. So I wasn't able to, in your analysis, able to figure out where that is captured. And the other question was, in none of your bounds, you have the number of arms. I'm not sure if epsilon somehow captures the number of arms. In particular, I feel that as the number of arms increase, the question becomes harder and harder. So which bound captures that? So these are the 2 questions. Thank you.
So yeah, definitely. So let's just very simply compare the bounds for the known TPM's case and the unknown TPM's case here. So this is min over h prime not equal to h. This is just finitely many alternatives. And then this is min over all possible arms configurations, not just the ones with h prime not equal to h, but also with TPMs being different. Okay, so this is a much broader class, I would say. So this minimum would be smaller because it's a much broader class that we are dealing with, and consequently this quantity as a whole will be smaller than this. In other words, 1 by r star would be bigger in the restless unknown TPM's case than in the known TPM's case. At a very high level, this just means that this case is slightly more easier than this because we have to battle with less alternatives. Now, coming to the number of arms, as you can see here, there is a k which comes in this summation in all of these quantities. K is the number of arms. So we haven't analyzed the case when k goes to infinity. I think that is also a very interesting question. I have been asked that several times. I have some clues on it in terms of what could perhaps come out in the analysis when k tends to infinity. There will be some integrals with respect to general distribution functions and things like that. But yeah, I mean, there is a dependence on k. It may not be explicit, but it is there. It is there in all of our bounds. And these are the main results that we prove. In all of the quantities that come in the bounds, we have the k coming in. I hope that
do you have some information on the growth with respect to k? I think that is the question rather than the explicit dependence.
Yeah, so actually, I haven't, we haven't done a very detailed analysis of what it will be like to have infinitely many arms. For example, does most of the effort concentrate on identifying, does most of the probability, that is the optimal distribution here, what I call as lambda here or pi lambda here. Pi lambda is simply conditional distribution, lambda of dot given dot. So does that lambda, that optimal lambda or the delta optimal lambda, does it focus most of its mass on the odd arm, or does it tend to, or does it, not focus most of the mass on the odd arm? I think this is something that needs to be brought out clearly. All I do know is that in the finite case, and k is finite, in the rested case, the mass is evenly distributed on the non-odd arms. That is, the optimal distribution lambda puts a certain mass lambda star on the odd arm, and it distributes the remaining mass 1 minus lambda star among the k minus 1 non-odd arms. So this is the structure of the optimal solution in the rested case. It is also the structure of the optimal solution in the case when the observations are IID. But we are not able to say so in the restless case because we don't have an explicit form or an explicit characterization of the even the delta optimal solutions. So yeah, I mean that is as much as I have thought about it.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Chandra,
Thank you,
next
sir.
question.
I think your analysis was based on the assumption that we are going to be watching one of the videos at each point in time. And we are selecting one of the videos to watch a sample at each point of time. But in practice, we may be watching pairs or triplets or subsets
Definitely,
of
yes,
simultaneously, right? So
yes,
what
correct.
happens in how would you look at that kind of a case?
Yeah, yes. So that will amount to sampling a subset of arms, possibly more than one arm at each time instant. So if you can recall, we said that the delay of one particular arm is equal to 1, and the delay of all the other arms are strictly greater. The delays of all the other arms are strictly greater than 1. Now, in that case, when we sample 2 or more arms at the same time, we could possibly do that. When we sample that, the delays of all those arms are going to be 1, and all the unobserved arms, the delays will be more than 1. So I think that needs to be captured. It needs to be brought in carefully, and for that particular model, I think the Markov decision problem needs to be written down. The transition probabilities need to be written down carefully. I think it can be done. I think that extension can be done, although I have not explicitly done it in my thesis, but I think it can be done. I have seen works like that in in some general hypothesis testing problems scenario. So I think that can be addressed.
Okay. One more small question is, do these results corroborate with the experiment you did with Krishna at the beginning of your presentation in some way, or is it possible to sort of make a connection?
So yes. So in order to explicitly tell, given 2 movies, in order to explicitly tell how much of time would be required to identify the odd movie and to compare that result with what comes out from our analysis, I think first it is important to capture how is it that the human eye perceives each image or each movie as. So there is a certain Poisson point process model that is proposed by neuroscientists for this particular model, for this particular thing, wherein there are a certain number of neurons in the IT cortex of the brain which actually fire when we look at a particular image or an object. And the number of neuron firings, the average number of firings in these neurons in the IT cortex is going to capture or is going to characterize what is the image that we are looking at. So perhaps an experiment at that level where we can actually get information about the number of neurons that are fired in the number of spikes that are observed in these neurons, number of firings that are observed in these neurons. If that can be captured somehow, I think there is some hope. I think that one can actually then corroborate the results. So this was actually done for static images by Vaidyan et al. This analysis has been done. Results have been corroborated with what was observed practically when the human subjects carried out these experiments. And the information from the IT cortex was not captured from humans, but it was from macaque monkeys. So this has been done for static images. It has not yet been done for dynamic images or movies. So if this can be done, I think there is hope.
Any other questions? Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much, Karthik. That brings us to the end of this colloquium. I request everyone to thank Karthik for his talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you so much for coming.
Karthik, we can stop the recording.
Yes, sir.